Edward Whitmore had always believed that the quietest moments in life revealed the loudest truths. On a cold evening in early autumn, he sat at the long oak dining table inside the house he had built with his own hands nearly 30 years earlier. The room was warm, filled with the glow of soft lights and the sound of silverware touching plates, but Edward felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Across the table sat his daughter, Sophia Whitmore, scrolling through her phone as if the conversation happening around her barely mattered. The house itself was beautiful, large windows, polished floors, and expensive furniture, but Edward knew something about that house that nobody else seemed to remember anymore. Every brick, every beam, and every corner had once carried his sweat, his sleepless nights, and his sacrifices. Tonight, however, none of that seemed to matter. The conversation slowly drifted toward the topic that had been quietly hanging in the air for months, Edward's age. One of Sophia's friends had made a casual joke about retirement and how older people should enjoy whatever time they had left. Most people would have laughed and moved on, but Sophia leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and looked directly at her father with a strange confidence in her voice. "Let's be honest, Dad," she said, her tone calm but sharp enough to cut through the room. "You're just waiting to die anyway. You're living on borrowed time." For a moment, the entire table went silent. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. Edward slowly lifted his eyes and looked at his daughter. Not with anger. Not with disappointment. Just with a long, thoughtful silence. Those words echoed in the room longer than anyone expected. Borrowed time. It was a strange phrase to hear from your own child. Some people at the table shifted uncomfortably, but Sophia didn't look ashamed. In fact, she seemed convinced that she had simply spoken the truth everyone else was too polite to say. Edward noticed something in that moment that hurt more than the words themselves. Sophia truly believed what she had just said. To her, her father was already fading away. A man from the past. A man who had already lived his life and had nothing left to offer the future. Edward slowly placed his fork down and wiped his hands with a napkin. His face remained calm, but inside his mind, memories began to move like old photographs being pulled from a dusty album. He remembered the long nights working 2 jobs when Sophia was still a child. He remembered the years when every spare dollar had gone into building security for his family. He remembered something else too. Something that nobody sitting at that table knew anything about. Something hidden. Something patient. Something powerful. Edward looked around the room quietly. Everyone assumed the same thing about him now. They believed he had spent everything years ago and was simply living out the rest of his life comfortably with what little remained. It was a comfortable story for them to believe. A simple story. But the truth about Edward Whitmore had never been simple. You see, Edward had spent decades learning a lesson that most people never truly understand. The loudest success is often the weakest. The strongest success is the one nobody sees coming. Over the years, while the world believed he had stepped away from business and money, Edward had quietly continued building something in the background. Not for attention. Not for praise. But for security. For control. For peace of mind. And he had done it so quietly that even his own daughter had never suspected it. Sophia picked up her glass and took a sip of water, clearly feeling satisfied with the conversation. To her, the matter was obvious. Her father was an old man who had already lived his best years. What she didn't realize was that Edward Whitmore was not the kind of man who spent 30 years building a life just to lose control of it at the end. Edward finally spoke, his voice steady and calm. "Borrowed time is an interesting phrase," he said quietly. Sophia shrugged slightly, not sensing anything unusual in his tone. "Well, it's true," she replied. "Everyone knows it." Edward simply nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "Everyone thinks they know many things." He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he stood up slowly from the table, gave a small polite smile, and walked calmly toward his study at the far end of the house. Nobody followed him. Nobody thought much about it. To everyone else in that room, the evening simply continued. But inside the quiet walls of his study, Edward Whitmore opened a drawer that had remained untouched for years. Inside that drawer rested a simple black folder. Nothing about it looked special. No one who glanced at it would imagine that it carried the quiet weight of decades of patience. Edward opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents, account statements, investment records, and property titles spread across multiple countries. Numbers filled the pages. Very large numbers. Edward Whitmore closed the folder gently and leaned back in his chair. Somewhere in the house, laughter could still be heard from the dining room. Sophia's voice carried faintly through the hallway. She believed she understood the value of her father's life. But the truth had a strange way of revealing itself when people least expected it. And sometimes, the people who think you are finished, simply standing at the beginning of your greatest surprise. So if you enjoy powerful stories about truth, family, and the quiet power of patience, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because Edward Whitmore's story is only beginning, and what happens next will change everything. Edward Whitmore sat alone in his study, the quietest room in the entire house. The sounds of laughter and conversation from the dining room had faded into the background, but the words his daughter had spoken earlier were still fresh in his mind. "You're just waiting to die, you're living on borrowed time." Most people would have reacted with anger. Some might have shouted back or tried to defend themselves. But Edward had lived long enough to understand something important about life. When people reveal what they truly think about you, it is often wiser to listen than to argue. He slowly opened the black folder resting on the desk in front of him. The folder looked ordinary, but inside it was the quiet record of more than 30 years of discipline, patience, and planning. Page after page held documents that told a very different story from the one his daughter believed. There were investment accounts that had grown steadily for decades, properties that had been purchased quietly when land was still cheap, and shares in companies that most people had never even heard of until they became incredibly successful. Edward ran his fingers gently across the papers, not with pride, but with the calm satisfaction of someone who had always believed in playing the long game. 30 years earlier, when Sophia was still a little girl, Edward had made a decision that changed the direction of his life. At that time, many of his friends were chasing fast money, buying expensive cars, showing off large houses, and living lives that looked impressive on the outside. Edward had chosen a different path. Instead of showing wealth, he chose to hide it. Instead of spending loudly, he invested quietly. Instead of seeking recognition, he built security. It had not been easy. There were years when he had worked late nights studying markets, learning about businesses, and carefully placing money into investments that most people ignored. While others spent their weekends relaxing, Edward spent his reading financial reports and analyzing opportunities that might grow slowly over time. Many people had once laughed at his cautious lifestyle. Some even believed he was too conservative, too quiet, too careful. But Edward had always understood something simple that many people forget: wealth that grows quietly often grows the strongest. He turned another page in the folder and looked at a document that showed the value of one particular investment. When he had first placed money into that company 25 years ago, it had seemed like a small decision. Today, that same investment was worth more than most people earned in an entire lifetime. Edward leaned back in his chair and closed the folder again. His daughter believed he was living on borrowed time. But what she didn't understand was that Edward Whitmore had spent decades building a life that did not depend on anyone's approval, respect, or expectations. And perhaps the most surprising part of all was that he had never once told his family about the full extent of what he had built. Not because he wanted to deceive them, but because he wanted to see something very important. He wanted to see how people would treat him when they believed he had nothing left to give them. That kind of test reveals more truth about people than any conversation ever could. Edward stood up and walked slowly toward the large window overlooking the quiet garden behind the house. The moonlight rested gently on the trees, and the world outside looked peaceful and still. Inside the house, however, something had already changed. For the first time, Edward realized that his daughter no longer saw him as the man who had built her life. She saw him as a fading figure from the past. And that realization created a decision in his mind. Edward would not reveal the truth immediately. Instead, he would watch. He would listen. He would allow time to show him something important about the people around him. Because sometimes the greatest lessons in life are not taught through anger or arguments. Sometimes they are revealed through patience. Edward returned to his desk and picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a familiar name. A man who had worked with him quietly for many years. His attorney. Edward pressed the call button. The line rang once, then twice, before a calm voice answered. "Good evening, Edward," the lawyer said. Edward smiled slightly. "Good evening," he replied. "I believe it may be time to review a few documents." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by a knowing tone. "Of course," the lawyer said. "Would you like to schedule a meeting?" Edward looked again at the black folder resting on his desk. "Yes," he said calmly. "And I think it's time my daughter attends as well." After the call ended, Edward sat quietly in the dim light of the study. Somewhere down the hallway, Sophia was still laughing, completely unaware that the future she believed she understood was about to change in ways she could never imagine. The truth had been hidden for decades, growing quietly, waiting patiently for the right moment to appear. And that moment was getting closer. But what Sophia Whitmore did not realize was that the real surprise waiting for her was not just the millions her father had hidden away. The real surprise was the lesson behind them. And that lesson was about to reveal itself in a way that none of them would ever forget. If this story is already opening your eyes to the quiet power of patience, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because in the next chapter Edward Whitmore begins a test that will reveal the true character of everyone around him, and the results will be far more shocking than anyone expects. The next morning Edward Whitmore woke before the sun, just as he had done for most of his life. The house was quiet, and for a moment he simply sat on the edge of his bed, thinking about the strange direction his life had taken. Years ago he had worked hard so his family would never struggle, yet somehow the comfort he created had slowly turned into something else. Respect had faded. Gratitude had disappeared. And now his own daughter believed he was just an old man waiting for the end. Edward stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen to make his morning coffee. As the kettle began to warm, he looked out the window at the peaceful garden behind the house. He had planted those trees himself when Sophia was still a child. He remembered her running across the grass, laughing, holding his hand as if he were the strongest person in the world. Back then she believed her father could solve any problem. Back then she had looked at him with admiration instead of quiet judgment. Edward poured the coffee into his cup and took a slow sip. Time changes people in ways we rarely notice until the distance becomes too large to ignore. But Edward was not a bitter man. He understood that people sometimes become careless with the things that have always been there for them. And that was exactly why he had made the decision he made the night before. Instead of arguing with Sophia or revealing his hidden wealth immediately, Edward decided he would do something much more powerful. He would watch carefully. He would observe the choices people made when they believed he had nothing left to offer them. Because when money disappears, people often reveal their true character. Later that afternoon Sophia walked into the living room while Edward was reading quietly in his chair. She looked at him with a casual expression, as if nothing important had happened the night before. "Dad," she said, "you should really think about downsizing this house soon. It's too big for you now." Edward slowly closed his book and looked up at her. "Downsizing?" he asked calmly. Sophia nodded. "Yes. Maintaining this place must be expensive. And honestly, you don't need all this space anymore." Edward listened quietly. The house she was talking about was the very house he had built for the family decades earlier. But he didn't interrupt her. Sophia continued speaking, clearly convinced she was being practical. "It would make things easier for everyone if you sold it. You could move somewhere smaller, maybe a retirement community. Somewhere comfortable." Edward studied her face carefully. She wasn't being cruel in her tone this time. In her mind she was simply making a logical suggestion. But what she didn't realize was that every word she spoke revealed something deeper about how she saw him now. Not as the man who built the home. Not as the man who created the life she enjoyed. But as someone whose time was nearly finished. Edward gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I see," he said quietly. Sophia looked relieved, believing he was agreeing with her. "Good," she replied. "I can help you start looking at places this week." Edward picked up his coffee cup and took another slow sip. Inside his mind, however, a quiet realization was forming more clearly with every conversation. His daughter wasn't trying to hurt him intentionally. She simply believed the story she had created in her own mind. The story where Edward Whitmore had already reached the final chapter of his life. What she didn't know was that Edward Whitmore had spent decades preparing a very different ending. That evening Edward made another quiet decision. If people believed he had nothing left, he would allow them to continue believing it just a little longer. Because the truth reveals itself more clearly when people feel safe enough to show their real intentions. 2 days later Edward called Sophia into the living room again. She walked in confidently, expecting another normal conversation. Edward spoke calmly. "Sophia, I've scheduled a meeting with my attorney next week." Sophia raised her eyebrows slightly. "Your attorney?" she asked. Edward nodded. "Yes. I think it's time to organize a few things." Sophia assumed she understood immediately. In her mind, this must be about a will, insurance, or the small amount of money she believed her father still had. She smiled politely. "That's a good idea," she said. "It's important to have those things arranged." Edward watched her reaction carefully but said nothing more. He simply nodded and returned to his book. As Sophia walked out of the room, she felt satisfied with the direction things were going. What she didn't realize was that the meeting she had just agreed to attend would soon change everything she believed about her father. Because inside the quiet black folder resting in Edward Whitmore's study were documents that told a completely different story. A story about hidden investments. International accounts. Properties that had grown in value for decades. A story that revealed Edward Whitmore was not a man living on borrowed time at all. He was a man who had quietly built a fortune while the world assumed he had stepped away from the game. And very soon, Sophia Whitmore would walk into a room where that truth would finally be revealed. The only question left was how she would react when she discovered that the father she believed had nothing, had actually been holding millions all along. And trust me, what happens when that moment arrives will leave everyone in that room completely speechless. So if you want to see the moment that changes everything, make sure you subscribe and stay with this story, because in the next chapter Edward Whitmore walks into the lawyer's office with a secret that is about to shake his daughter's entire world. The morning of the meeting arrived quietly, but for Edward Whitmore it carried the calm weight of a moment he had prepared for many years. The sky was clear, the air cool, and the city was already beginning to wake as he drove slowly toward the tall glass building where his attorney's office was located. Edward's hands rested calmly on the steering wheel. There was no anger inside him, no desire to embarrass anyone, and no interest in proving himself right. What he wanted was something far more important than revenge. He wanted the truth to reveal itself. Meanwhile, Sophia Whitmore arrived at the building with a completely different expectation. She stepped out of her car, glanced at the impressive entrance, and assumed the meeting would be short and simple. In her mind this was only about paperwork. Maybe a small inheritance discussion. Maybe insurance documents. She believed she already understood the full story of her father's finances, and in that story there was nothing surprising left to discover. When she entered the lobby she saw Edward standing near the elevators, calm as always, holding a small black folder in his hand. The same folder that had remained hidden in his study for decades. "Good morning, Dad," Sophia said casually as she walked toward him. Edward smiled gently. "Good morning, Sophia." They rode the elevator together in silence until they reached the top floor. When the doors opened, a quiet receptionist greeted them and guided them toward a large office with wide windows overlooking the city. Inside the room sat Edward's attorney, a composed man who had worked with him for many years and understood exactly what this meeting meant. The lawyer stood up politely and shook Sophia's hand. "Thank you for coming," he said. Sophia smiled politely but still seemed relaxed, even slightly bored. She believed this meeting was simply another responsible step for an aging parent. They all took their seats around the large wooden table in the center of the room. Edward placed the black folder on the table and slid it gently toward the attorney. The lawyer opened the folder slowly and began organizing several documents in front of him. At first Sophia paid very little attention. She leaned back slightly in her chair and checked her phone while the lawyer quietly reviewed the papers. Then the attorney cleared his throat and began speaking. Mr. Whitmore has asked me to review several financial holdings and long-term investments today, he said calmly. Sophia nodded politely, still not expecting anything unusual. The lawyer lifted the first document and placed it on the table. First, he said, we have a property portfolio consisting of multiple residential and commercial holdings acquired over the past 28 years. Sophia looked up slightly, her attention beginning to shift. The lawyer continued. Several of these properties are located in high-growth areas and have significantly increased in value. He placed another document beside the first. Next are private investment accounts connected to international markets. Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly. She leaned forward in her chair. International accounts, she asked quietly. The lawyer nodded calmly. Yes. These accounts have been managed through long-term dividend strategies and equity growth. Another set of papers appeared on the table. In addition, Mr. Whitmore holds shares in several companies that have experienced substantial appreciation over the past 2 decades. Sophia's phone slowly lowered from her hand. Her expression began to change as the lawyer calmly listed the figures connected to each asset. Numbers filled the pages. Large numbers. Larger than anything she had ever associated with her father. Finally the lawyer paused and placed one final document at the center of the table. When combined, he said evenly, Mr. Whitmore's total assets currently exceed several million euros. The room became very quiet. Sophia stared at the papers in front of her as if they belonged to someone else. Her mind struggled to process what she had just heard. She slowly turned her eyes toward her father. Edward Whitmore sat exactly as he always had, calm, patient, and composed. The same man she believed had already reached the end of his importance. This can't be right, Sophia said softly. The lawyer simply turned the documents toward her so she could see the records more clearly. Dates. Account numbers. Property titles. Years of careful planning recorded in black ink across official pages. Sophia's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Dad, why didn't you ever tell us? Edward folded his hands gently on the table and looked at his daughter with the same calm expression he had shown her his entire life. Because, he said quietly, I wanted to understand something very important. Sophia looked confused. Edward continued. When people believe you have nothing left to give them, you discover how much they truly respect you. Those words hung in the air like a mirror reflecting something Sophia had never expected to see. In that moment she remembered the things she had said. The way she had spoken about downsizing the house. The way she had assumed her father's life was already reaching its end. The realization slowly spread across her face like a shadow moving across the room. Edward stood up slowly and walked toward the large window overlooking the city. For decades he had built his wealth quietly, without praise or attention. And now the truth had finally appeared. But the most powerful part of the moment was not the money. It was the lesson behind it. Sophia Whitmore had just discovered that the father she believed was living on borrowed time had actually been holding a future far greater than she ever imagined. And what Edward Whitmore was about to say next would change their relationship forever. So if you want to see the moment that brings this story to its powerful conclusion, make sure you subscribe and stay with the story, because the final chapter reveals a lesson about respect, patience, and hidden strength that no one in that room will ever forget. The room remained completely silent after the lawyer finished speaking. The sound of the city outside the tall windows seemed distant, almost unreal. Sophia Whitmore sat frozen in her chair, staring at the documents spread across the table as if the numbers might suddenly change if she looked at them long enough. Just hours earlier she had walked into this building believing she already understood everything about her father's life. In her mind, Edward Whitmore was simply an old man preparing the final chapter of his story. But the truth sitting on that table had just shattered that belief completely. Millions in investments. Properties across different cities. Accounts that had quietly grown for decades. The man she believed had nothing left, had actually built something extraordinary in silence. Sophia slowly lifted her eyes toward her father. Edward Whitmore stood calmly near the window, looking down at the busy streets below. There was no pride in his posture, no anger in his face, and no desire to celebrate the shock that had just filled the room. Instead, he looked peaceful, as if this moment had been waiting patiently for many years to arrive. Sophia finally found her voice. "Dad. I don't understand," she said softly. "Why didn't you ever tell me about any of this?" Edward turned slowly and looked at her with gentle eyes. For a moment he said nothing, allowing the weight of the question to sit quietly in the room. Then he walked back toward the table and placed his hands lightly on the documents. "Because money can hide the truth about people," he said calmly. Sophia frowned slightly, confused by the answer. Edward continued speaking in the same steady tone that had carried him through decades of life. "When people know you have wealth, they treat you differently. Sometimes they show kindness because they expect something in return." He looked directly at his daughter. "But when people believe you have nothing, that is when you see how they truly feel." Sophia lowered her eyes. The words hit deeper than any argument ever could. Edward was not accusing her. He was simply revealing something she had never stopped to think about before. The memory of the dinner table came rushing back into her mind. The moment she had leaned back in her chair and said the words that now echoed painfully inside her thoughts. "You're just waiting to die. You're living on borrowed time." She suddenly realized how small those words sounded now compared to the quiet strength her father had carried all along. Edward gently closed the black folder and slid it toward the lawyer. "I didn't build this wealth to prove anything to anyone," he said. "I built it to protect my future and my family." He paused briefly before adding something even more important. "But respect cannot be purchased with money. Respect must exist even when there is nothing to gain." Sophia felt a deep heaviness in her chest. For the first time in years, she looked at her father not as an aging parent, but as the man who had quietly carried responsibility for their entire family without ever asking for recognition. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. The words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that had been missing for a long time. Edward studied her face for a moment before giving a small understanding smile. "Life has a way of teaching all of us lessons," he said gently. "Some lessons just arrive later than others." The lawyer quietly gathered the documents and placed them back inside the folder, leaving father and daughter alone with the meaning of what had just happened. Edward walked back toward the window once more and looked out across the city skyline. The buildings stood tall under the bright afternoon sun, a reminder that time continues moving forward whether people notice it or not. After a moment he spoke again. "The money will remain protected and carefully managed," he said. "But the most important thing in this family will never be the money." Sophia looked up. Edward turned back toward her with calm confidence. "The most important thing will always be character." Those words settled into the room like a quiet promise. Sophia stood slowly from her chair and walked toward her father. For the first time in many years, she wrapped her arms around him without thinking about inheritance, property, or future wealth. She simply hugged her father. Edward gently returned the hug, knowing that sometimes the most valuable change in life is not measured in money, but in understanding. As they left the office building together later that afternoon, Sophia saw her father differently than she ever had before. Not as a man living on borrowed time, but as a man who had spent his life building strength, patience, and wisdom in silence. And sometimes the quietest people carry the greatest stories. Now, if this story touched you or made you think about the way we treat the people who built our lives, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next powerful story. And I'm also curious about something very special. Stories like this connect people from all around the world. So go down to the comment section right now and tell me where you are watching this story from. Let's see how many countries are here listening together, because no matter where you are in the world, the lesson in Edward Whitmore's story is the same. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has spent a lifetime building more than you can see.